Nobody expected the housekeeper to inherit my father's most valuable secret. Not because Grace Whitmore was unkind, not because she was untrustworthy, but because people have a strange habit of overlooking those who quietly hold families together. The day the lawyer announced it, the room became so silent that I could hear the old grandfather clock ticking in the hallway outside his office. For a moment, nobody moved, nobody spoke. Even the lawyers seemed to understand the weight of what had just happened. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I am 69 years old, a retired elementary school teacher from Connecticut, and until that morning, I believed I understood my father better than anyone alive. Looking back now, I realize how wrong I was. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and looked around the conference table. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows behind him, painting long golden rectangles across the polished wood surface. Outside, October leaves drifted slowly through the air. Inside, however, every face remained frozen. My father, Arthur Brooks, had passed away 6 weeks earlier at the age of 89. He lived a long life, a respected life, and while losing him left an ache that never fully disappeared, his death itself had not surprised us. What surprised us was what he chose to leave behind. Most of his estate had already been settled. The properties, investments, savings accounts, and charitable donations had all been distributed according to his wishes. We assumed everything important was finished. We were wrong. Mr. Brooks left one final instruction, the lawyer said carefully. One item that he considered more valuable than any property, account, or financial asset. Across the table, my son Ethan leaned forward immediately. His expression sharpened in a way I had seen many times during business meetings. Ethan was not a bad man. He worked hard. He loved his family. But over the years, he had become increasingly focused on achievement, success, and results. My daughter-in-law, Vanessa, sat beside him, holding a paper coffee cup between both hands. Vanessa was intelligent, organized, and ambitious. She had grown up in a family that struggled financially, and although she rarely spoke about it, I often wondered whether those early years still shaped the way she viewed security. Neither of them looked greedy. They looked curious. Yet beneath that curiosity lingered expectation. The lawyer opened a sealed folder. Arthur Brooks specified that his most valuable secret would be inherited by Grace Whitmore. The words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Vanessa blinked. Ethan stared. One cousin actually laughed before realizing nobody else was laughing. Across the table, Grace looked as shocked as the rest of us. Her hands remained folded quietly in her lap. For nearly 30 years, Grace had worked for our family. Most people called her our housekeeper. The title was technically accurate, but it never felt complete. She remembered birthdays that relatives forgot. She delivered soup when someone was ill. She sat beside my father during long afternoons after my mother passed away. She noticed loneliness before anyone else did. Yet despite all that, many people still viewed her as staff. Helpful, reliable, invisible, certainly not an heir. Certainly not the person entrusted with my father's greatest secret. There must be some misunderstanding, Ethan said finally. The lawyer shook his head. There is no misunderstanding. Vanessa carefully placed her coffee cup on the table. What exactly is this secret? I am not authorized to reveal that today. Her expression tightened slightly. Not anger. Frustration. The frustration of someone who dislikes unanswered questions. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Then why tell us? The lawyer folded his hands. Because Arthur specifically requested that everyone be present when Grace learned she had been chosen. Chosen. The word caught my attention immediately. Not rewarded. Not compensated. Chosen. I glanced toward Grace. Her silver blonde hair framed a face that looked genuinely confused. If she knew anything about this secret, she hid it remarkably well. The lawyer reached into the folder and removed a cream-colored envelope. Unlike the official legal documents surrounding it, this envelope appeared personal, almost ordinary. He slid it across the table. Toward Grace. These are Arthur's final instructions. Nobody moved. The envelope sat there between them like a locked door waiting to be opened. Finally, Grace reached forward and picked it up. Her hands trembled slightly. Watching her, an old memory suddenly surfaced. About a year before his death, my father and I sat together on the porch overlooking the lake behind his house. The evening sun reflected off the water while geese drifted silently across the surface. During our conversation, he said something strange. People spend their lives protecting the wrong treasures. When I asked what he meant, he only smiled and changed the subject. At the time, I assumed he was talking about family memories. Now I was not so sure. "Open it," Vanessa said softly. Grace looked uncomfortable. Before she could respond, the lawyer gently intervened. "The contents belong to Grace. She may read them whenever she chooses." An awkward silence followed. Across the room, the grandfather clock continued ticking. Steady, patient, unbothered by the confusion unfolding around it. Finally, Grace opened the envelope. She removed a single folded letter. As her eyes moved across the page, I watched her expression carefully. First confusion, then surprise, then something deeper, something emotional. When she finished reading, she lowered the paper slowly. Her eyes glistened. "Grace," I asked quietly. She looked toward me. "Your father left instructions." Ethan sighed. Obviously, Grace ignored the interruption. "He wanted me to visit the lake property." My heartbeat quickened immediately. The lake property had belonged to our family for generations. Most people remembered the main cabin beside the water. Very few remembered the smaller buildings hidden farther back among the pine trees. "Why?" Ethan asked. Grace shook her head. He didn't explain. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Arthur arranged transportation, access, and authorization. Everything has already been prepared." Vanessa frowned. "Prepared for what?" "I don't know." For the first time, even the lawyer sounded curious. Grace looked back at the letter. "There's one thing he wrote." The room became still again. "What did he say?" I asked. Grace swallowed before answering. "He wrote that some truths cannot be trusted to the people who want them most." Nobody spoke after that. Ethan looked away. Vanessa stared at the table. Even the lawyer seemed unsettled. As for me, I felt a chill move through my chest. Because for the first time since my father's funeral, a possibility entered my mind that I had never considered before. What if this inheritance was never about money? What if my father had spent years protecting something far more valuable? And what if the person he trusted most was not the person anyone expected? The drive home from the lawyer's office felt longer than usual. Autumn sunlight filtered through the windshield as I followed the winding roads back toward town. Yet my thoughts remained trapped inside that conference room. One sentence repeated itself over and over in my mind. Some truths cannot be trusted to the people who want them most. It did not sound like a legal instruction. It sounded like a warning, or perhaps a lesson. Either way, it sounded exactly like my father. Arthur Brooks had never been interested in dramatic speeches. When he wanted someone to understand something, he rarely explained it directly. Instead, he left clues inside ordinary conversations and trusted people to find the meaning themselves. Unfortunately, most of us spend our lives listening only halfway. That evening, I sat alone in my kitchen long after sunset. The house felt unusually quiet. Since retiring from teaching, I had grown accustomed to silence, but this felt different. It felt expectant, as if something had begun moving beneath the surface of our family, and nobody yet understood where it would lead. Around 7 o'clock, my phone rang. "Ethan." I already knew what he wanted before answering. "Have you talked to Grace?" he asked immediately. "No greeting. No small talk. Just the question." "Good evening to you too," I replied. He sighed. "Sorry, Mom. I'm just trying to understand what's happening." I believed him, at least partly. Ethan sounded more confused than angry. "No," I said. "I haven't spoken to her." There was a brief silence. "Do you think Grandpa was hiding money?" The question surprised me less than it should have. "Why would you assume that?" "Because what else could it be?" I stared through the kitchen window into the darkness outside. Maybe that's exactly the question Grandpa wanted us to ask. Another silence followed. "Vanessa thinks there's something bigger going on." Vanessa thinks there always has to be something bigger going on. He laughed softly. "That's fair." For a moment his voice relaxed. Then curiosity returned. "You really don't know anything?" "No, neither does Grace." "I don't think so." Ethan exhaled slowly. I just don't understand why he would choose her. The answer came to me before I had time to stop it. Maybe because she never expected to be chosen. The line went quiet. Ethan didn't respond. Eventually we said goodbye and hung up, but the conversation stayed with me long afterward. The next morning I woke before sunrise. A thin layer of fog covered the neighborhood. As I carried my coffee to the dining room table, I noticed something unusual. A handwritten envelope sat in my mailbox. My name appeared on the front in familiar handwriting. My breath caught immediately. Arthur Brooks. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. My father had been gone for 6 weeks, yet there was no mistaking the careful lettering. I carried the envelope inside and opened it carefully. A single note rested within. Eleanor, if this letter reaches you, Grace has already received her instructions. Please remember something important. People often reveal themselves when they believe they are waiting for a reward. Pay attention. Dad, that was all. No explanation. No details. Just 7 words that immediately unsettled me. People often reveal themselves when they believe they are waiting for a reward. Throughout the day, I could not stop thinking about it. Then, shortly after lunch, Grace called. Eleanor. Her voice sounded tired. Are you all right? I think so. You don't sound sure. There was a pause. I've been reading the letter again. I sat down immediately. And your father wants me to visit the lake property tomorrow morning. By myself. Yes. Something about the way she said it made me uneasy. What else? Another pause followed. There was a second page. My grip tightened around the phone. The second page? I didn't notice it yesterday. What does it say? I heard paper rustling. Then Grace began reading aloud. Dear Grace, if you're reading this, then I am trusting you with something that matters more than money. Before you unlock anything, before you open anything, before you reveal anything, I need you to observe. Watch carefully. Listen carefully. The truth will tell you who is ready for it. He sat motionless. Grace continued. There are people who seek answers because they want understanding. There are others who seek answers because they want control. Learn the difference. The room seemed strangely quiet after those words. That's very Arthur, I whispered. Yes. Grace sounded thoughtful, almost as if this entire thing is some kind of test. A test. The possibility had crossed my mind too. Not a test of intelligence. Not a test of inheritance. A test of character. Grace, I asked carefully, do you think my father distrusted the family? No. Her answer came immediately. Then what do you think? For several seconds, she didn't speak. Finally, she said, I think he was worried about what people were becoming. After the call ended, I found myself replaying dozens of memories. Family gatherings, holiday dinners, conversations around kitchen tables. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then, small moments began surfacing. Ethan checking work emails during Thanksgiving dinner. Vanessa asking practical questions about property maintenance before my father's funeral had even taken place. Relatives discussing investment values more passionately than family memories. None of those things made them bad people. Yet, viewed together, they formed a pattern I had never fully acknowledged. That evening, another surprise arrived. Vanessa appeared at my front door, carrying a pie. The gesture itself was not unusual. Vanessa often brought food when she wanted to talk. Can I come in? She asked. We sat together in the living room while darkness settled outside. For several minutes, she spoke about ordinary things. Work, family, the weather. Finally, she set down her coffee cup. Eleanor, can I ask you something honestly? Of course. She hesitated. Do you think Arthur trusted me? The question caught me completely off guard. For the first time since this entire mystery began, Vanessa didn't sound ambitious or suspicious. She sounded vulnerable. Why would you ask that? Her eyes lowered. Because everyone assumes I'm worried about money. She forced a small smile. Maybe I've given them reasons to think that. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then she continued quietly. The truth is, when you grow up watching your parents lose everything twice before you're 20, security becomes hard to ignore. Suddenly, several things made sense. Her constant planning, her obsession with preparation, her discomfort with uncertainty. I wasn't thinking about inheritance after Arthur died, she admitted. I I was thinking about what happens when families fall apart. For the first time, I saw something deeper beneath her behavior. Not greed. Fear. Fear disguised as control. Fear disguised as practicality. And as I listened, another realization slowly emerged. Maybe my father's secret wasn't only going to reveal hidden truths about our family. Maybe it was going to reveal hidden truths about each of us. The next morning, before sunrise, Grace would leave for the lake property. None of us knew exactly what waited there. But for the first time, I had a growing suspicion that whatever my father left behind was not hidden inside a building. It was hidden inside people. And Arthur Brooks, even after death, was somehow still teaching us how to see it. Grace left before sunrise the next morning. I knew because my phone rang at 5:23, just as I was pouring coffee into my favorite blue mug. Outside, the world remained dark and quiet. A thin mist hovered above the streets, and the porch lights of neighboring houses still glowed softly in the darkness. "I'm on the road," Grace said. Her voice sounded steady, but beneath that calm I detected something else. Not fear, responsibility. "How are you feeling?" I asked. She laughed softly. "Ask me again in a few hours." I smiled despite myself. Fair enough. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Grace added, "Arthur wanted me to do this alone." "I know. I think I'm beginning to understand why." Before I could ask what she meant, she wished me a good morning and ended the call. The rest of the day moved painfully slowly. I tried reading. I tried gardening. I even attempted to organize old photo albums that had been gathering dust in my closet for years. Nothing worked. My thoughts kept returning to the same questions. Why Grace? Why now? And what exactly had my father spent so many years protecting? Around noon, Ethan called. Then he called again at 1:30. By the third call, I finally laughed. "You realize calling me every 90 minutes won't make Grace drive any faster." "I know," he admitted. "I just hate not knowing." His honesty surprised me. "That's not the same thing as needing control, Ethan." Silence filled the line. "Maybe not," he said eventually, "but they're close cousins." That answer lingered with me after we hung up. My father would have appreciated it. It was the first truly self-aware thing I had heard from Ethan since this mystery began. Around 4 o'clock, dark clouds rolled across the sky. Wind rattled the trees outside my house. Autumn rain began tapping softly against the windows. Then my phone finally rang again. "Grace." I answered immediately. "Grace." For several seconds, all I heard was wind. Then her voice emerged through the speaker. I found it. My heart skipped. The lake house. Not the main house. Her voice lowered. "Something else." I sat down immediately. "Tell me." More wind. Then the sound of an old door creaking somewhere nearby. "Do you remember the East Cabin?" Every muscle in my body seemed tense. I haven't thought about it in years. Neither had I. The East Cabin sat nearly a quarter-mile behind the main lake house, hidden among tall pine trees. When I was a child, we were never allowed near it. My grandfather owned it first. Later, my father maintained it quietly. Nobody ever explained why. Eventually, most of us forgot it existed at all. "The key opened the door," Grace said. And there was a long pause. "Eleanor, this place hasn't been abandoned." That answer surprised me. "What do you mean?" "Someone has been maintaining it." My confusion deepened. "Recently?" "Very recently." Rain struck my windows harder. "How can you tell?" "The roof was repaired. The locks were replaced. The shelves are clean." She paused. "Arthur planned for someone to come here." A chill moved through me. Not because the cabin existed, because my father expected someone to eventually open it. He had prepared for this moment. "What did you find inside?" I asked. Silence. Then Grace exhaled slowly. "Boxes." "What kind of boxes?" "Archifo boxes." My stomach tightened. "How many?" "Dozens." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Grace added something that unsettled me even more. "They're organized." My father loved organization. Everything in his office had a place. Every document had a label. Every photograph had a date. Hearing that word instantly made the situation feel more serious. "What's inside?" I asked. I heard cardboard shifting in the background. Letters. More rustling. Documents. Another pause. Photographs. My pulse quickened. Photographs of what? People. Family. Some family. Her voice became thoughtful. Some aren't. That answer confused me even more. What do you mean? I don't know yet. Then she said something unexpected. Arthur wasn't collecting possessions. What was he collecting? The answer came softly. Stories. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. Inside my living room, every sound suddenly seemed distant. Stories. Not money. Not investments. Not secret properties. Stories. There's something else, Grace continued. Every box has a year written on it. A year. Some go back decades. My mind raced. Why would he save decades of records? Grace didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded almost reverent. I think your father spent years paying attention to people. That sentence struck me harder than I expected. Because if there was one thing Arthur Brooks did exceptionally well, it was observe. He noticed who arrived early, who stayed late, who remembered birthdays, who forgot promises. He noticed things most people overlooked. Grace, I asked quietly, do you think this has something to do with inheritance? No. Her answer came instantly. Then what? I heard pages turning. I found a note taped inside the first box. What did it say? She read directly from the page. People reveal themselves through patterns, not moments. My breath caught. That sounded exactly like Arthur. Not because it was dramatic, because it was true. Anyone can be generous once. Anyone can be patient once. Anyone can be kind once. Character isn't built from moments. It's built from patterns. There are journals too, Grace said. How many? At least 20. I closed my eyes. 20 journals. Decades of observations. Decades of stories. Decades of things my father believed were worth preserving. Then Grace fell silent. Grace! There's another room. My eyes opened immediately. Another room? Behind a locked interior door. My pulse quickened. Do you have the key? No. Then how do we open it? Wind moved through the trees around her. The cabin creaked softly. Finally she answered. I think Arthur wanted me to earn it. Earn it. The instructions say I have to understand what's in these boxes first. I stood and walked toward the window. Rain streamed down the glass. Somewhere 90 miles away, Grace stood inside a forgotten cabin surrounded by decades of my father's carefully preserved records. What do you think is behind that door? I asked. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Then Grace answered with a sentence that stayed with me long after the call ended. I think your father wasn't hiding a secret from the family. Another pause. I think he was protecting the family from a truth they weren't ready to see. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined Grace standing inside the east cabin, surrounded by boxes filled with decades of my father's observations. Rain continued falling long after midnight, tapping softly against my bedroom windows. Somewhere between sleep and wakefulness, one question kept returning. What truth could possibly require this much preparation? By morning, the storm had passed. Sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor while I stood at the counter staring into a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. My thoughts remained 90 miles away in the pine forest surrounding the lake property. Shortly after 8 o'clock, my phone rang. Grace. I answered before the first ring finished. Please tell me you've slept. Grace laughed softly. Not much. I had a feeling. I heard pages turning in the background. I've been reading. The journals? The first few. Her voice sounded thoughtful. Not frightened. Not excited. Thoughtful. Somehow that concerned me more. And, for a moment, she remained silent. Then she said something I did not expect. Arthur wasn't documenting events. What was he documenting? Choices. I sat down immediately. What do you mean? More pages rustled. The entries aren't about major family milestones. She paused. They're about ordinary moments. I frowned. Ordinary moments. Yes. Another pause. The kind most people forget. She began reading from one of the journals. June 14th, family dinner. Eleanor stayed behind to help clean, even though she hosted the entire gathering. Nobody asked her to. Nobody thanked her. She did it anyway. I froze. That's one of the entries. Yes. Grace turned another page. September 3rd. Ethan promised to call his grandfather and forgot for 3 weeks. When reminded, he apologized sincerely and visited the next day. That doesn't sound like criticism, I said. It isn't. Grace sounded increasingly certain. That's what's strange. Arthur isn't judging people. Then what is he doing? Observing patterns. The phrase immediately reminded me of the note she found inside the first box. People reveal themselves through patterns, not moments. Suddenly the journals began making more sense. My father wasn't collecting evidence against anyone. He was recording who people became over time. Grace, I asked carefully, are there entries about everyone? Almost everyone. Including you? A small laugh escaped her. Quite a few. What do they say? Another pause. Mostly things I wish he hadn't noticed. That answer surprised me. Such as, she flipped through pages. Helping him after doctor's appointments. Bringing groceries. Driving him to church when he stopped feeling comfortable driving at night. Silence. Followed. Then Grace added quietly, things that shouldn't be remarkable. Her answer lingered in my mind long after she spoke it. Because she was right. None of those acts were extraordinary. They were simply consistent. Reliable. Quiet. The kind of things my father valued more than grand gestures. There's something else, Grace said. Her voice became more serious. The journals change over time. Ow! The earlier entries are mostly observations. She turned another page. The later ones become questions. That caught my attention immediately. Questions. Questions Arthur was asking himself. My heartbeat quickened slightly. Can you read one? There was a brief pause. Then Grace began. If people knew they would never receive anything from me, who would still choose to stay? The room suddenly felt colder. That's what he wrote. Word for word. I stared out the kitchen window. Across the street, a neighbor walked his dog beneath trees painted gold and red by autumn. Everything looked normal, yet nothing felt normal anymore. There are dozens like that, Grace continued. Questions about loyalty, character, responsibility, gratitude. Another page turned. This one is from 4 years ago. She cleared her throat and read aloud. I have spent my life building assets. I now wonder if I spent enough time building understanding. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Hearing those words felt strangely intimate, as if my father were speaking directly from the past. Then Grace reached another section. This time she didn't read immediately. What is it? I asked. I found references to a project. My pulse quickened. A project. That's the exact word he uses. What kind of project? I'm not entirely sure yet. More pages turned, but it appears he began working on it after your mother's death. My chest tightened. My mother had passed away nearly 15 years earlier. Her loss affected my father more deeply than most people realized. Outwardly, he remained strong. Internally, I suspect part of him never fully recovered. What does he say about it? I asked quietly. Grace located the passage and began reading. After Margaret died, I realized how quickly memories become stories, and stories become assumptions. People begin remembering what is convenient rather than what is true. If I want future generations to understand who we were, I must leave something more reliable than memory. I closed my eyes. Suddenly the boxes, the journals, the photographs, the notes, everything began fitting together. My father wasn't preserving secrets. He was preserving perspective. Arthur believed families slowly rewrite their own history, Grace said softly, and he wanted to stop that from happening. I nodded even though she couldn't see me. That sounded exactly like him. Then I heard something unexpected, a metallic sound. Grace! Hold on. More movement. Footsteps. Then silence. What happened? I found something. My heartbeat accelerated immediately. What? A key. I stood up so quickly my chair nearly tipped backward. A key, hidden inside one of the journals. To what? For several seconds, Grace didn't answer. Finally she spoke. I think it opens the locked room. Every muscle in my body tightened. The locked room. The room beyond the interior door. The place my father apparently wanted her to reach only after understanding the journals. Are you going in? I asked. Not yet. Why not? Grace exhaled slowly. Because I finally understand what Arthur was trying to teach. Her voice sounded different now. Clearer. More certain. And The secret isn't behind the door. I frowned. Then what is? The answer came quietly. The explanation. I stood motionless in my kitchen, because for the first time since this mystery began, I realized Grace might be right. Whatever my father considered his most valuable secret wasn't hidden inside a room. It wasn't hidden inside a box. It wasn't hidden inside a document. It was something larger, something that required years of observation to understand. And whatever waited behind that locked door wasn't the secret itself. It was the reason my father believed the secret mattered. For the rest of that day, I could think about little else besides the locked room. Not because I believed it contained hidden wealth or some dramatic family secret. That assumption had already begun to fade. What unsettled me was something else entirely. My father had spent years preparing Grace to reach that door. Not through instructions, through understanding. He wanted her to see something first, to learn something first, to become the right person before opening it. The more I thought about that, the more remarkable it seemed. Arthur Brooks had always believed that knowledge carried responsibility. As a child, I often heard him say that information without wisdom was dangerous. At the time, it sounded like one of many lessons adults enjoy repeating. Now, standing in my kitchen decades later, I began to understand what he meant. Around noon, Ethan arrived unexpectedly. He knocked once before letting himself inside. "Mom," he called. "Kitchen." He entered carrying takeout containers from a local diner. "You forgot to eat lunch yesterday." I raised an eyebrow. "You've been checking on me?" He shrugged. "Maybe Grandpa's journals are already working." That made me laugh. For a moment, he looked younger, less burdened. Then his expression became serious. "Have you heard from Grace?" "This morning." Ethan pulled out a chair and sat down. And I studied him carefully. Something felt different. The urgency from earlier conversations seemed diminished. Curiosity remained, but it no longer carried the same edge. "She found a key." His eyes widened. "A key? To a locked room." For a moment, the old excitement returned. Then he surprised me. "Did she open it?" "No, why not?" "Because she thinks the room contains answers, not the secret itself." Ethan stared at the table. Instead of arguing, he nodded slowly. "That sounds like Grandpa." We ate lunch together in thoughtful silence. Eventually, Ethan spoke again. "Can I tell you something?" "Of course." He hesitated. "I've been thinking about what Grandpa wrote." "Which part?" "The part about people revealing themselves when they think a reward is coming." I waited. The truth is, when the lawyer first mentioned secret inheritance, I immediately assumed it was something valuable. He laughed quietly. And by valuable, I meant expensive. I appreciated his honesty. Most people would. Maybe. He looked out the window. But Grandpa wouldn't. No, he wouldn't. That was the problem. We had all spent weeks trying to understand Arthur Brooks through our own assumptions instead of his values. The difference mattered. Later that afternoon, my phone rang again. "Grace." I opened the room. My heart immediately began racing. And silence filled the line. Not dramatic silence. Thoughtful silence. "Grace." I'm trying to figure out how to explain it. Start anywhere. I heard footsteps echoing faintly in the background. The room isn't what I expected. "What did you expect?" "A vault." She laughed softly. "Or at least a storage area." "And what is it?" The answer stunned me. "A library." I blinked. "A library?" "Floor-to-ceiling shelves." She paused. "Books. Journals. Boxes. Photographs." My confusion deepened. "That's what was hidden." "Not exactly." Her voice lowered. "The books aren't random." I sat down immediately. "What do you mean?" "Arthur organized them by subject." "Subject?" "Character. Integrity. Leadership. Forgiveness. Family." For several seconds, I couldn't speak. It sounded less like a secret room and more like a university built by one man. "There are notes everywhere," Grace continued. "Handwritten comments inside books. Personal reflections. Cross-references to journal entries." Another pause. "It's like he spent decades building a map." "A map to what?" I asked. The answer came slowly. "To understanding people." Outside my kitchen window, a breeze stirred fallen leaves across the yard. Everything felt strangely still. "There's a desk in the center of the room," Grace said. "And on it, a sealed envelope." My pulse quickened again. Addressed to you? No, then who? She hesitated. To whoever finally understood why the room existed. A chill moved through me. That's very Arthur. Extremely Arthur. I could hear her smile through the phone. Did you open it? Yes. And for several seconds, she remained silent. Then she read aloud. If you have reached this room searching for wealth, you have arrived at the wrong destination. If you have reached this room searching for understanding, welcome. I closed my eyes. That sounded exactly like my father. Grace continued reading. The greatest mistake people make is believing character appears suddenly. It is not. Character grows through thousands of ordinary decisions. The problem is that most people only notice outcomes. Very few notice patterns. My father had spent years studying those patterns. Not because he wanted to judge people, because he wanted to understand them. There's more, Grace said. Read it. She turned the page. For years I worried about what my family would inherit. Eventually I realized I was asking the wrong question. The better question was this. What values will they carry forward when I am gone? The words settled heavily between us. Not because they were shocking, because they were true. Then Grace reached the final paragraph. If my family is ever to receive this inheritance, they must first understand that it was never meant to belong to one person. It belongs to everyone willing to learn from it. I stood silently in my kitchen, because for the first time, I finally understood why my father chose Grace. Not because she knew a secret, not because she was hiding information, not because she expected anything. He chose her because she was willing to listen before speaking, to observe before judging, to understand before deciding. The exact qualities required to carry something larger than money. Eleanor, Grace said quietly, I think Arthur left us a responsibility. What kind? There was a long pause before she answered. I think he wanted us to decide what happens next. And as the afternoon sunlight faded across my kitchen floor, I realized that the mystery which had begun with an inheritance was slowly becoming something else entirely. It was becoming a choice about whether we would simply preserve Arthur Brooks's work or allow it to change us. The following morning, I woke with a feeling I had not experienced in weeks. For the first time since my father's funeral, I was no longer obsessed with discovering the secret. Instead, I found myself wondering what we were supposed to do with it. That difference may sound small, but it changed everything. For weeks, everyone had focused on finding answers. Now the answers were beginning to appear, and a new question had taken their place. What responsibility comes with understanding the truth? Around 9 o'clock, Grace called again. Unlike previous conversations, her voice carried a sense of certainty. I think I found Arthur's final project, she said. I immediately sat down. The one mentioned in the journals? Yes. Papers shuffled in the background. It's not a document. Then what is it? It's an entire collection. My pulse quickened. A collection of what? Stories. For several seconds, I thought I had misunderstood. Stories. Real ones. Grace paused. Hundreds of them. She explained that behind a library's shelves sat dozens of archival binders. Each binder contained carefully organized records of people my father had encountered throughout his life. Family members, employees, neighbors, friends, teachers, business partners, church volunteers, complete strangers whose paths crossed his for only a short period of time. Why would he keep all that? I asked. Grace's answer came immediately. Because Arthur believed ordinary lives mattered. The simplicity of the answer stunned me. Most people preserve accomplishments. My father preserved people. There's something remarkable about these records, Grace continued. Arthur wasn't interested in success. What do you mean? Some of the most detailed files are about people who never became wealthy or famous. She flipped through a binder. One is about a school janitor. Another page turned. One is about a waitress. Another. One is about a mail carrier. I smiled despite myself. That sounded exactly like Arthur Brooks. He had always been fascinated by character rather than status. There's a note attached to many of the files, Grace said. What kind of note? She began reading. This person made life better for others without expecting recognition. Preserve their story. A lump formed in my throat. There are dozens like that, Grace continued. Maybe hundreds. Suddenly, everything began making sense. The journals, the observations, the library, the project. Arthur wasn't creating a record of wealth. He was creating a record of human goodness. Not perfection, goodness. Around noon, Ethan called. This time he sounded different, more thoughtful than curious. "Mom, do you have a minute?" "Always. I've been thinking." I laughed softly. "That sounds dangerous." "Probably." For a moment we both smiled. Then his voice grew serious. "What if Grandpa wasn't worried about leaving something behind?" "What do you mean?" "What if he was worried about people forgetting what mattered?" The observation surprised me. Not because it was wrong, because it was exactly right. "I think you're beginning to understand him," I said. Silence followed. Then Ethan admitted something I never expected to hear. "I spent years trying to impress him. You know he loved you." "I know." He paused. "But I don't think I understood what actually impressed him." That sentence stayed with me long after our conversation ended. Because Arthur Brooks was never impressed by titles, income, or achievements. He admired integrity, reliability, kindness, consistency, qualities that rarely appear on resumes but shape entire lives. Late that afternoon, Grace called once more. This time her voice carried unmistakable emotion. "Eleanor, what happened?" For several seconds, she couldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than usual. "I found a file about your mother." My heart immediately tightened. "Mom." "Yes." I stood and walked toward the window. Outside, sunlight reflected off golden leaves scattered across the lawn. "What does it say?" Papers rustled gently. Then Grace began reading. Margaret Brooks understood something many people never learn. The strongest acts of love often happen when nobody is watching. I closed my eyes. The words felt like hearing my father speak again. Grace continued. She never asked whether her efforts would be remembered. She asked whether they were needed. Tears gathered unexpectedly in my eyes. "There's more," Grace said. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Margaret taught me that a family survives not because of what it owns, but because of what it practices repeatedly. Patience, forgiveness, responsibility, generosity." By the time Grace finished reading, I could barely speak. My parents had been married for nearly 60 years. Hearing my father describe my mother through the lens of gratitude felt deeply personal. Then Grace said something that changed the entire direction of our conversation. "Eleanor, I think Arthur knew exactly what would happen after he died." I wiped my eyes. "What do you mean?" "I think he knew people would assume there was money involved." "Probably. And I think he allowed them to believe it." That thought had never occurred to me before. "Why would he do that?" Grace took a slow breath. "Because expectation reveals character." The room fell silent. Suddenly, I remembered the note my father mailed to me. People often reveal themselves when they believe they are waiting for a reward. It had been there from the beginning. We simply failed to understand it. "Grace," I asked quietly, "do you think Grandpa was testing everyone?" No, her answer came instantly. "Then what was he doing?" She paused before responding. "I think he was giving everyone an opportunity to see themselves honestly." That answer felt more accurate than anything we had discussed so far. Not a test, not a trap, a mirror, a chance to confront who we were becoming. As evening settled across Connecticut, I sat alone in my living room thinking about everything we had learned. The secret wasn't money. The inheritance wasn't ownership. The library wasn't a vault. Arthur Brooks had spent decades creating something far more unusual. He had created a living record of character, a collection of stories reminding future generations that ordinary acts of kindness matter, that integrity matters, that people matter. And somewhere deep inside, I began to suspect that the most important part of his inheritance had not yet been revealed. Because if Arthur Brooks spent decades building this collection, he almost certainly had one final lesson waiting for the family. And knowing my father, it would arrive at exactly the right moment. 3 days passed before Grace finally returned from the lake property. During that time, she called occasionally, sharing small discoveries from Arthur's collection. Yet I could tell she was holding something back. Not because she wanted to keep secrets, because she was trying to understand them first. When she finally arrived at my house on a cool October afternoon, She carried a leather briefcase that had belonged to my father and a cardboard archive box filled with carefully organized folders. The sight alone made my heart beat faster. We settled at the dining room table, while sunlight streamed through the windows. Grace placed the briefcase between us. For several seconds, neither of us touched it. "You found something important," I said. Grace nodded slowly. "Very important." Her expression was thoughtful rather than excited. That alone told me whatever she discovered carried weight. "What is it?" She opened the briefcase and removed a thick folder labeled simply, "Legacy." The word was written in Arthur's familiar handwriting. My throat tightened immediately. "I've read most of it," Grace said quietly, "but I think some parts should be read together." I nodded. "Then let's read them together." Grace opened the folder. The first pages contained notes written over several years. Reflections, observations, questions, many centered around a single idea. What does a person truly leave behind? Not what they own, not what they earn, not what they build, but what remains inside the lives of others after they are gone. He kept coming back to that question, Grace said, over and over. I wasn't surprised. My father had always believed the most important questions deserved years of thought. Then Grace turned to another section. This time the pages contained names. Hundreds of names. Family members, friends, employees, neighbors, community volunteers, people from every stage of Arthur's life. Beside each name appeared handwritten notes. Some were only a sentence long. Others filled entire pages. "What is this?" I asked. "His final assessment." The phrase immediately made me uncomfortable. Assessment. Grace noticed my reaction. Not judgment. She tapped one of the pages. Understanding. She handed me a file. It belonged to a man named Samuel Turner, one of my father's former employees. The notes describe how Samuel quietly worked extra shifts to help a co-worker struggling with medical bills. Another file described a librarian who spent 20 years organizing free reading programs for children. Another told the story of a widow who anonymously paid utility bills for struggling neighbors during winter months. I looked up. These aren't famous people. Exactly. Grace smiled softly. Arthur didn't care about fame. She pointed toward another note written in my father's hand. The world remembers extraordinary achievements. I am more interested in extraordinary character. I sat silently for a moment. Then Grace reached deeper into the folder. Her expression changed. More serious now. This is where things become personal. My pulse quickened. She placed several family files on the table. My name, Ethan's name, Vanessa's name, other relatives. Have you read them? I asked. Some. And Grace hesitated carefully. Arthur saw strengths in everyone. And weaknesses? Those too. We spent the next hour reading. Not every observation was flattering. Some highlighted impatience. Others mentioned pride, fear, insecurity, or missed opportunities. Yet none felt cruel. My father wasn't exposing flaws. He was documenting growth. The person described in an entry from 10 years earlier often looked different from the person described 3 years later. He believed people could change, I said quietly. More than that. Grace pointed toward another note. He expected them to. That sentence stayed with me. Arthur never viewed character as fixed. To him, character was something people practiced, something people strengthened or neglected through daily choices. Then Grace reached the bottom of the folder. Beneath everything else sat a sealed envelope. Unlike the others, it bore no name. Only 3 handwritten words. To the family. My stomach tightened immediately. Another letter. Grace nodded. I think it's the final one. Neither of us moved for several seconds. Somehow, this envelope felt different from all the others. Heavier. More significant. Did you read it? I asked. No, why not? Grace looked directly at me. Because Arthur left instructions. Of course he did. By now that hardly surprised me. What instructions? She handed me a note clipped to the envelope. Open only when the family is gathered together. Read aloud. No exceptions. I stared at the words. The familiar handwriting made it feel as though my father was still guiding events from somewhere just beyond reach. He planned everything. Yes. Grace smiled sadly. And I think he knew this would be the hardest part. What? She looked at the envelope. Because this isn't about discovering the truth anymore. Her voice lowered. It's about accepting it. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the trees. Fallen leaves scattered across the yard. The afternoon sunlight had begun fading into gold. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question lingering in my mind. Do you think the family is ready? Grace considered carefully before answering. Some are. And the others? A faint smile touched her face. Arthur never waited for people to become ready. She glanced toward the envelope. He believed understanding often arrives after the conversation begins. That sounded exactly like him. Not forcing answers, creating opportunities, trusting people to grow into them. We arranged the family gathering for the following Saturday. As Grace prepared to leave, she paused at the front door. There's one more thing. What? She looked back toward the dining room where the sealed envelope still rested on the table. The final letter isn't very long. No. A thoughtful expression crossed her face. But I have a feeling it might change everything. After she left, I returned to the dining room and stared at the envelope for a long time. For weeks, everyone believed the mystery centered around a hidden inheritance. Then we thought it centered around a secret library. Then we thought it centered around the collection itself. Now I wasn't so sure, because knowing Arthur Brooks, the true inheritance was probably hidden inside a single idea. A lesson simple enough to fit inside one letter, yet powerful enough to shape generations. And in just a few days, every member of the family would finally hear it. Saturday arrived beneath a clear autumn sky. The air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves, and sunlight painted the Brooks family home in shades of gold and amber. By noon, cars began filling the driveway. One by one, relatives arrived carrying desserts, casseroles, and the awkward uncertainty that often accompanies important family gatherings. Nobody knew exactly what Arthur Brooks had left inside the final letter. Yet everyone understood it mattered. Inside the house, chairs had been arranged in a circle throughout the living room. The same grandfather clock stood in the hallway. The same fireplace occupied the far wall. The same family photographs lined the shelves. Yet the room felt different now. More reflective, more honest. Almost as if my father had somehow changed the atmosphere of the house itself. Ethan arrived early. To my surprise, he offered to help arrange chairs without being asked. Vanessa followed shortly afterward carrying 2 homemade pies. Months earlier, I might have interpreted the gesture as an attempt to impress people. Now I wasn't so sure. Over the past several weeks, something had changed in her. Not dramatically, quietly. The kind of change that reveals itself through small actions rather than grand announcements. Grace arrived last. She carried the sealed envelope inside a leather folder and placed it carefully on the coffee table at the center of the room. The sight immediately drew everyone's attention. Conversations softened. People took their seats. The room gradually fell silent. For a brief moment, nobody moved. The only sound came from the grandfather clock marking another passing second. Tick, tick, tick. Then Grace stood. Arthur wanted everyone present before this was opened. She glanced around the room. Everyone is here. A strange feeling settled over me. Not anxiety, anticipation. For weeks we had followed a trail leading from a lawyer's office to a hidden cabin, from journals to photographs, from questions to understanding. Now, we had reached the final step. Grace carefully broke the seal. The crackling sound seemed unusually loud inside the quiet room. She unfolded several pages and began reading. If you're hearing these words, then you have already discovered something important. My greatest secret was never hidden in the cabin. It was never hidden in the journals. It was never hidden in the library. Several people exchanged confused glances. Grace continued. Those things were only tools. The real inheritance was always something else. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Vanessa lowered her eyes to the floor. The room remained perfectly still. For years, I watched people search for value in the wrong places. They searched in bank accounts, titles, properties, and accomplishments. Yet the people who left the deepest impact on my life rarely possessed any of those things. A lump formed in my throat. That sounded exactly like Arthur. Grace turned the page. I met wealthy people who contributed very little to the lives around them. I met ordinary people whose kindness changed entire communities. If there's one lesson I hope survives after I am gone, it is this: never confuse importance with visibility. The words settled heavily over the room. Never confuse importance with visibility. Suddenly, every part of the mystery began connecting together. Grace, the housekeeper, the overlooked person, the trusted person, the person nobody expected. Grace continued reading. Some of the most valuable people in your life may never stand in front of a room. They may never receive awards. They may never appear successful by conventional standards. Yet they quietly hold families together, strengthen communities, and make difficult days easier to endure. I glanced toward Grace. Her eyes remained fixed on the page. For the first time, I wondered whether my father had been describing her all along. Then Grace reached another paragraph. Years ago, I began asking myself a simple question. If every possession I owned disappeared tomorrow, which relationships would still matter? The answer changed my life. Several relatives shifted in their seats. Nobody looked uncomfortable. Instead, people appeared thoughtful, reflective, as if they were asking themselves the same question. Then Grace read the next section. Ethan, ambition is a gift. But never allow ambition to convince you that achievement matters more than people. Success is most meaningful when it strengthens relationships rather than replacing them. Ethan lowered his head slightly, not in shame, in understanding. Grace continued. Vanessa, security is important. Planning is wise, but fear can disguise itself as control. Remember that trust grows through openness, not protection alone. For a moment, Vanessa closed her eyes. I recognized the expression immediately. It was the look of someone hearing a truth they already suspected but never fully acknowledged. Then came my section. Eleanor, you spent many years believing quiet contributions went unnoticed. They did not. The people who create stability often receive the least recognition and deserve the most gratitude. Tears blurred my vision, not because of praise, because my father understood me so completely. Grace paused before turning the final page. The room remained silent. Every person seemed fully present now, fully engaged. Arthur had their attention exactly as he intended. The final inheritance I leave behind is not contained inside these records. It is contained inside a choice. Every generation must decide what kind of people they wish to become. Character is not inherited. It is practiced. Trust is not inherited. It is earned. Legacy is not inherited. It is created. The words seemed to echo through the room long after Grace finished reading them. Then she lowered the letter. Nobody spoke. Not immediately. The silence lasted nearly a minute. Yet unlike the silence in the lawyer's office weeks earlier, this silence felt different. That silence was built from confusion. This silence was built from understanding. Finally, Ethan stood. He looked around the room before speaking. I spent weeks wondering why Grandpa trusted Grace. His voice was steady. I think I finally understand. Nobody interrupted him. He trusted her because she listened when everyone else was searching for answers. He glanced toward Grace, and because she cared more about responsibility than ownership. Grace looked down at the letter resting in her hands. For a moment, emotion crossed her face. Then Ethan did something nobody expected. He walked across the room and gently hugged her. Not as an employee, not as an outsider, as family. And as I watched the scene unfold beneath the warm autumn light, I realized the final. Inheritance Arthur Brooks left behind wasn't a secret. It was a shift in perspective, a chance to see value where we once overlooked it, a chance to recognize the people who quietly shape our lives. And judging by the faces around that room, the lesson had finally begun to take root. The weeks that followed the family gathering were quieter than I expected. Not because nothing changed, quite the opposite. The changes simply arrived in the way most meaningful changes do, slowly, almost invisibly at first. There were no dramatic confrontations, no arguments, no shocking revelations. Instead, people began making different choices. Small choices, ordinary choices, The exact kind my father spent years documenting. One Tuesday afternoon, about 3 weeks after the reading of the final letter, I received a phone call from Ethan. At first, I assumed it would be another quick conversation squeezed between meetings. Instead, he asked a question that caught me completely off guard. "Mom, would you like to have dinner on Friday?" "Friday," I repeated. "Just dinner. Just dinner." I smiled. "You realize you're speaking to a retired teacher. You don't have to schedule me 3 days in advance." He laughed. "Old habits." When Friday arrived, Ethan and Vanessa came to my house, carrying groceries instead of takeout. To my surprise, they insisted on cooking. The meal itself wasn't extraordinary. Roast chicken, vegetables, homemade bread. Yet the evening felt different from countless family dinners before it. Nobody checked phones. Nobody rushed conversations. Nobody seemed distracted by schedules waiting elsewhere. At one point, Ethan found himself telling stories about his grandfather that I had never heard before. Stories from fishing trips, long drives, quiet conversations during college visits. As I listened, I realized something remarkable. For years, Ethan had remembered these moments. He simply hadn't made time to revisit them. Later that evening, after Vanessa helped clear the table, she lingered in the kitchen while Ethan carried dishes to the sink. "Can I ask you something?" she said quietly. "Of course." She hesitated. Was Arthur disappointed in me? The question surprised me because it sounded sincere. Not defensive, not angry, vulnerable. "Why do you ask?" Vanessa looked down at her hands. "Because some parts of the letter felt painfully accurate." I considered my answer carefully. Arthur didn't spend decades studying people because he wanted to condemn them. She looked up. "Then why?" "Because he believed people could grow." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she smiled faintly. "That's probably why he never gave simple answers." Exactly. A few days later, another unexpected development occurred. Grace invited me to visit the lake property. The invitation itself wasn't unusual. What surprised me was her reason. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," she explained over the phone. "Who?" "You'll see." Curiosity finally won. The following Saturday morning, I drove north through winding roads lined with brilliant autumn colors. The lake property looked much as it always had. The water reflected the sky like glass. Pine trees surrounded the shoreline. The old dock stretched quietly into the lake. Yet something about the place felt lighter now, less mysterious, more welcoming. When I arrived, Grace was standing near the porch speaking with a young woman in her early 20s. The woman turned as I approached. "Eleanor, this is Rebecca." Grace smiled. "She's helping organize Arthur's collection." Rebecca extended her hand. "It's an honor to meet you." We spent the afternoon reviewing files, photographs, and notes. During one conversation, Rebecca revealed something that deeply moved me. "Do you know why I volunteered for this project?" she asked. "Why?" She opened one of the binders. "Because I never knew my grandfather." Her voice softened. "Most of what I know about him comes from stories people barely remember." She glanced toward Arthur's collection. "Your father preserved something most families lose." That observation stayed with me. For weeks, I had viewed the collection as an inheritance. Rebecca helped me see something larger. It was also a gift to future generations, a bridge between people who might never meet. As the afternoon passed, we uncovered story after story. A retired firefighter who spent years mentoring troubled teenagers. A school secretary who secretly purchased winter coats for students in need. A mechanic who repaired vehicles for elderly neighbors free of charge. None of them were famous. None appeared in history books. Yet according to Arthur, their lives mattered. Their character mattered. Their stories deserved preservation. As the sun began lowering toward the horizon, Grace and I walked toward the shoreline. The lake shimmered beneath the golden light. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, I broke the silence. "Do you know what surprises me most?" "What?" Grace asked. I looked across the water. At the beginning, everyone thought this story was about inheritance. Grace smiled, including us, especially us. We both laughed softly. Then my expression became thoughtful. "Now I think it was about attention." Grace nodded immediately. Arthur paid attention. The simplicity of those 3 words struck me. My father paid attention. To people, to patterns, to kindness, to character, to things most of us moved too quickly to notice. The realization felt both obvious and profound. Then Grace said something I would never forget. Most people spend their lives trying to be seen. She looked toward the lake. Arthur spent his life seeing other people. The truth of that statement settled over me like the evening sunlight, because perhaps that was the real secret all along. Not money, not records, not journals. The ability to truly see people, to notice their struggles, their growth, their goodness, their humanity. As the last rays of sunlight stretched across the water, I found myself wondering how different the world might be if more people practiced that skill. And for the first time since this journey began, I realized Arthur Brooks may have left behind something even more valuable than wisdom. He left behind an example. Winter arrived gradually that year. Frost appeared along rooftops in the early mornings. Bare branches stretched across gray skies. The lake near my father's property grew quieter as migrating birds disappeared southward and the tourist season faded into memory. Yet despite the colder weather, something inside our family felt warmer than it had in years. Change, I was learning, rarely announces itself. It reveals itself through patterns. And after spending months surrounded by Arthur Brooks's journals, I found myself noticing those patterns everywhere. One evening in December, Ethan called unexpectedly. "Mom, are you busy?" "Not particularly. Can you meet me tomorrow?" His tone sounded unusually serious. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." He hesitated. "I just want to show you something." The next afternoon we met at a small coffee shop overlooking the Connecticut River. Snow flurries drifted lazily outside the windows while people hurried along the sidewalks, bundled in winter coats. Ethan arrived carrying a notebook. Not a laptop, not a tablet. A notebook. I immediately smiled. "You started journaling." He laughed. "Everyone keeps saying that." "Because it's true." He slid the notebook across the table. "Grandpa's fault." I opened it carefully. Inside were handwritten reflections, observations, lessons, questions, not daily events. Personal growth. Some entries described mistakes. Others documented conversations. Several focused on moments when Ethan noticed himself choosing differently than he would have a year earlier. "You've been paying attention," I said. Ethan nodded. "That's the whole point, isn't it?" For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he pointed toward one entry. "Read that one." The entry described a meeting at work. A younger employee had made a mistake that delayed an important project. Ethan admitted his first instinct was frustration. Yet instead of embarrassing the employee publicly, he invited him to lunch. During their conversation, Ethan discovered the young man had been caring for a sick parent while struggling to keep up with responsibilities. The situation reminded him of something Arthur once wrote. People often need understanding before they need correction. I looked up from the notebook. "Your grandfather would have liked this." Ethan smiled softly. "I think so too." Then his expression became thoughtful. "You know what's strange?" "What?" "For years I thought Grandpa was evaluating people." He looked toward the snowy river outside. "Now I think he was trying to understand them." That distinction mattered. Evaluating creates distance. Understanding creates connection. The older I became, the more important that difference seemed. A week later, another unexpected event occurred. Grace invited several family members to visit the community center where she and Rebecca had begun organizing portions of Arthur's collection. When I arrived, volunteers were carefully cataloging photographs, journals, and personal stories. The project had grown far beyond anything I imagined. "This is incredible," I whispered. Grace smiled. "People keep offering to help." "Why?" I asked. Rebecca answered before Grace could. "Because they recognize themselves in these stories." She gestured toward one display table. "Most people don't see their lives reflected in history books." I walked closer. The display contained photographs of ordinary individuals whose stories Arthur preserved. A school crossing guard, a retired nurse, a mechanic, a church volunteer. Beside each image sat a short summary of their contributions to the people around them. Reading them felt surprisingly emotional. None of these people would ever become famous. yet each left a positive mark on the lives of others. Arthur believed those stories mattered. Increasingly, I agreed. As the afternoon continued, I noticed several visitors reading quietly. Some smiled, others wiped away tears. A few simply stood in thoughtful silence. The collection was doing exactly what my father hoped. It was helping people recognize value where they might otherwise overlook it. Later that evening, after most volunteers left, Grace and I sat alone near one of the displays. Snowflakes drifted outside the windows while soft holiday music played somewhere in the building. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Of course. Do you ever wish Arthur had chosen someone else?" Grace looked genuinely surprised. "Why would I?" "Because carrying all this responsibility can't be easy." She smiled thoughtfully. "No, it isn't easy." Then she glanced around the room. "But Arthur didn't choose me because I was special." I raised an eyebrow. "You may be the only person in Connecticut who believes that." She laughed softly. "What I mean is, he didn't choose me because I was extraordinary." Her gaze moved toward one of the displays. "He chose me because I paid attention." The word sounded familiar, almost identical to the lesson emerging from every journal, every letter, every conversation. Pay attention to people, to character, to what truly matters. Then Grace said something that stopped me completely. "The truth is, Eleanor, Arthur wasn't preserving stories." "No, not exactly." She looked directly at me. "He was preserving evidence that ordinary kindness changes lives." For several seconds, I simply stared at her. Because she was right. Every story, every journal, every photograph, every lesson pointed toward the same conclusion. Small acts matter. Consistent acts matter. Character matters. As Christmas approached, the family gathered more frequently than usual. Dinners became regular again. Phone calls lasted longer. Conversations grew deeper. Nobody became perfect overnight. Disagreements still happened. Mistakes still happened. Yet something fundamental had shifted. People seemed more willing to listen, more willing to understand, more willing to see one another clearly. And as I sat beside the Christmas tree one quiet evening, watching snow fall outside my living room window, I found myself thinking about the day this entire journey began. The lawyer, the envelope, the shocked faces around the conference table. At the time, everyone believed Arthur Brooks had left behind a secret. Looking back now, I realized he hadn't hidden the secret at all. He had been demonstrating it every day of his life. We simply hadn't been paying attention. By February, nearly 8 months had passed since my father's funeral. The snow-covered landscapes of winter stretched across Connecticut, and life had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and unexpectedly different. Looking back, I often found it difficult to identify the exact moment everything changed. It certainly wasn't the lawyer's announcement. It wasn't the discovery of the East Cabin. It wasn't even the final letter. The real change happened gradually through dozens of conversations, reflections, and choices that followed, much like the patterns my father spent years documenting. One Saturday morning, I visited the community center earlier than usual. The collection had continued growing. Volunteers now helped organize stories submitted by people from neighboring towns. Teachers contributed memories about former students. Families shared stories about grandparents. Local organizations donated photographs and records that might otherwise have been forgotten. What began as Arthur Brooks's personal project was slowly becoming something larger than any of us imagined. As I entered the building, I found Rebecca arranging materials for an upcoming community exhibit. "You're here early," I said. She smiled. "Couldn't sleep." "Nervous?" "A little." Later that evening, the center would host its first public presentation of selected stories from the collection. More than 100 people had registered to attend. "Arthur would be amazed," I said. Rebecca looked around the room thoughtfully. "I don't think he'd be surprised." No. She pointed toward one of the display boards. "He spent decades proving that people care about stories like these." I followed her gaze. The board contained photographs of ordinary individuals whose actions had quietly improved the lives around them. None were famous, yet each story carried emotional weight, the kind that stays with people long after details fade. Around noon, Ethan arrived carrying several boxes of newly printed materials. Watching him work alongside volunteers still felt strange sometimes. Not because he seemed out of place, because he seemed completely at home. During a break, we sat together near one of the windows overlooking the snowy parking lot. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. "Always." He smiled. I used to think Grandpa's project was about preserving memories. And now, I think it was about preserving perspective. The observation impressed me. "Explain." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Most families remember events." He paused. "Grandpa wanted people to remember character." I thought about that for a moment. Then I nodded. "You're right. Because events alone rarely tell the full story. Character explains why those events mattered." A few hours later, Vanessa arrived carrying refreshments for the evening presentation. As she arranged trays near the entrance, I noticed how naturally she interacted with everyone. Months earlier, she often seemed guarded in unfamiliar situations. Now she appeared more comfortable, more open, more present. At one point, she joined me near the displays. "You know," she said quietly, "I owe Arthur an apology." I raised an eyebrow. "For what?" She smiled faintly. "For assuming this was about inheritance." We both laughed. "You weren't the only one." "No." Her expression became thoughtful. "But I think I understand something now." "What's that?" Vanessa looked around the room, filled with stories, photographs, and volunteers preparing for the evening. "The safest investment isn't money." No. No, her eyes softened. "It's people." The answer surprised me only because it came from her. Months earlier, those words would have sounded unlikely. Now, they felt completely genuine. As evening approached, guests began arriving. Families, teachers, students, retirees, community leaders, neighbors. Before long, every seat in the presentation hall was occupied. Additional visitors stood along the walls. The atmosphere felt warm despite the winter weather outside. When the event officially began, Grace stepped onto the small stage at the front of the room. For a moment, she simply looked at the audience. Then she smiled. "Most of you never met Arthur Brooks." Soft laughter moved through the room. "But tonight isn't really about him." That immediately captured everyone's attention. Arthur believed something unusual. She paused. He believed ordinary people leave extraordinary legacies. The room grew quiet. Throughout the presentation, volunteers shared selected stories from a collection. A crossing guard who protected generations of children. A widow who quietly supported struggling families. A teacher who spent decades encouraging students who doubted themselves. A nurse who comforted patients with no relatives nearby. Story after story reminded the audience of something increasingly rare. Human goodness often happens quietly. Its impact lasts far longer than we realize. Near the end of the evening, Grace displayed one final photograph. It showed Arthur standing beside the lake, smiling toward the camera. The image had been taken only a year before his death. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Grace read one final passage from his notes. "If future generations remember anything from this collection, I hope it is this: never underestimate the influence of a life lived with integrity." The world changes because ordinary people choose kindness when no reward is guaranteed. A profound silence settled across the room. Not sadness, reflection, understanding. I felt tears gathering unexpectedly in my eyes. Around me, many others seemed equally moved, because everyone recognized the truth inside those words. When the presentation ended, people remained long afterward. They talked, shared stories, introduced themselves to strangers, reconnected with old friends. In a way, the evening itself became part of Arthur's legacy, proof that stories still bring people together. As I helped clean up later that night, I found myself standing beside the large photograph of my father. For a moment, I simply looked at it. Then I smiled, because for the first time, I realized something important. Arthur Brooks never expected people to become perfect. He never expected them to agree on everything. He never expected them to avoid mistakes. He only hoped they would keep growing, keep learning, keep paying attention. And judging by everything I had witnessed over the past several months, that hope had not been misplaced. Spring arrived quietly that year. Snow disappeared from the hills surrounding the lake. Trees slowly filled with new leaves. The air grew warmer, the days grew longer, and life continued moving forward as it always does. It's something about that spring felt different. Nearly a year had passed since the afternoon we gathered in the lawyer's office and learned that Grace Whitmore had inherited what Arthur Brooks called his most valuable secret. Looking back, it seemed almost impossible that so much had grown from a single envelope. Not because of money, not because of property, but because one man chose to pay attention to things most people overlook. On a bright Saturday morning in May, our family gathered once again at the lake property. This time there were no lawyers, no sealed letters, no unanswered questions. We came together simply because we wanted to. Ethan arrived carrying folding tables. Vanessa brought homemade desserts. Several cousins volunteered to prepare lunch. Rebecca organized a small display featuring stories recently added to the collection. Children ran across the grass near the shoreline, while adults arranged chairs beneath the shade of the old maple trees. Watching everyone work together, I felt a sense of peace that had been absent for many years. Not perfection, peace. There is a difference. Families rarely become perfect, but they can become more honest, more grateful, more connected. Around noon, Grace and I walked toward the dock while everyone else prepared lunch. The lake shimmered beneath the sunlight. Gentle waves moved against the wooden posts. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, I smiled. Do you realize this all started because nobody expected you to inherit the secret? Grace laughed softly. I remember. Most people assumed Grandpa had hidden something valuable. He did. I looked toward her. You know what I mean? She smiled but didn't answer immediately. Instead, she watched a pair of ducks glide across the water. Arthur understood something most people don't, she said finally. What's that? Value and visibility are not the same thing. I nodded. Those words had become one of the central lessons of the entire journey. The most valuable people are often the least visible. The strongest acts of kindness often happen when nobody is watching. The most meaningful legacies are often impossible to measure. After lunch, Rebecca gathered everyone near the shoreline. She wanted to share an update about the collection. Over the previous months, hundreds of news stories have been submitted. Teachers, nurses, veterans, caregivers, neighbors, volunteers, ordinary people whose actions had quietly improved the lives around them. Arthur's collection no longer belongs to one family. Rebecca explained. It's becoming something larger. Looking around at the faces gathered near the lake, I realized she was right. What began as one man's effort to preserve character had become a community project, a living reminder that integrity, compassion, and responsibility still matter. Then Rebecca revealed one final surprise. She opened a small wooden display case and carefully removed a framed handwritten note. We found this among Arthur's papers several weeks ago, she said. It appears to be the last thing he ever wrote. Instantly, everyone's attention focused on the frame. Rebecca began reading. If you are reading this someday, then my experiment succeeded better than I hoped. I never wanted my family to inherit my possessions. Possessions eventually disappear. I wanted them to inherit perspective. A profound silence settled over the group. Rebecca continued. The world will always encourage you to admire wealth, status, and achievement. There is nothing wrong with those things. But never forget to notice character. Character determines what people do when recognition is absent. Character determines how they treat those who cannot benefit them. Character determines the legacy they leave behind. Several people lowered their eyes. Others stared thoughtfully toward the lake. I felt my throat tighten, not because the message was sad, because it felt timeless. Then Rebecca read the final paragraph. If my family remembers anything after I am gone, let it be this. Pay attention to the people who quietly make life better for others. They are often carrying treasures the world cannot see. For several moments, nobody spoke. Wind moved gently through the trees overhead. Somewhere in the distance, birds called across the lake. The entire scene felt strangely perfect, not staged, Not dramatic, simply real. Eventually, Ethan stepped forward. He looked around at everyone gathered there. I spent most of my life believing success was about building something important. He smiled faintly. Grandpa taught me that success is also about noticing what is already important. Vanessa reached for his hand. Nearby, several relatives nodded in agreement. The lesson had reached each person differently, but it had reached them nonetheless. As the afternoon continued, conversations drifted naturally from story to story. Old memories resurfaced. New plans emerged. Laughter echoed across the property. Watching it all unfold, I found myself thinking about the first question that started everything. Why Grace? Why had Arthur chosen the person nobody expected? Standing there beside the lake, I finally understood the answer completely. He chose Grace because she represented the very lesson he wanted everyone to learn. She was someone whose value had always been present, someone who contributed quietly, someone who cared without demanding recognition, someone who saw people clearly. In many ways, she was living proof of everything Arthur believed. As the sun slowly descended toward the horizon, golden light spread across the water. Families began packing up chairs and folding tables. Children chased one another across the grass. Conversations continued in small groups. Nobody seemed eager to leave. I remained near the shoreline for a few moments longer, watching the reflection of the sky dance across the lake. Nearly a year earlier, I thought my father had left behind secret. Eventually, I learned he left behind something far more valuable. A way of seeing, a way of paying attention, a way of recognizing the quiet dignity and worth inside ordinary people. And perhaps that was the greatest inheritance anyone could receive. Not money, not property, not even knowledge, but the ability to see others more clearly than before. As I turned toward the house and the people waiting there, I felt a calm gratitude settle over me. The mystery was over. The inheritance had been understood. The lesson had been shared. And for the first time in a very long while, I understood exactly what my father had spent his life trying to preserve. He wasn't preserving stories. He was preserving humanity. And thanks to him, a little more of it would remain in the world long after he was gone.